Hi students, it's Mrs. T again, and we are going to continue our discussion of subsistence strategies. So there was a glitch with twice or three times in the most recent video because I'm trying to use a different screen capture software than the one I was using because my camera was freezing. I don't know if that happened on any of the geography videos I made for you, but it did on the sociology ones. So I'm trying to do this, and apparently typing made the video stop. So I'll just pick up with it if it happens again, but forgive in advance any glitches that happen. Okay, so let's pick up with where we left off, talking about foraging and horticulture and pastoralism. These are subsistence strategies. Remember, they are survival plans. But when you have very small populations and when you have a subsistence strategy such as foraging that does not manipulate the environment so that unnatural amounts of food are produced, you keep your population intentionally low. So if we go back to stage one of the demographic transition model, let me do that with you really quick. There it is. Stage one has a really low total population with a really low NIR. You see it stays relatively even. And this low population in this demographic transition, this is actually shows you what life was like after agriculture became the dominant subsistence strategy. So there was a high birth rate, but also a high death rate. With foraging, there is not a high birth rate and there's not a high death rate because populations are intentionally kept small. So I think one of the last things I told you about foraging in the previous video was that it's a very conservation-minded way of being. And it's conservation minded without even knowing what the word conservation is. The word conservation is not even necessary in the language pattern for a forager because conservation and sustainability, another word that you and I have heard many times, and it's a big buzzword in geography anyway, but conservation and sustainability are not within the mental scope of a forager because they're not going to modify the natural environment at all to do damage to the natural environment. Their subsistence strategy, their habits, their norms, their customs, their traditions, the knowledge that's passed from one generation to the next includes the fact that you must respect the natural environment, period, because that's what keeps you alive. And it also has the norm, the habit, the value that land is not something, the natural environment is not something that an individual or a social group can own. So when we were looking at these borders of countries and things on maps in previous lectures, these borders, geopolitical borders or otherwise, they don't exist in the mind of a forager because the natural environment is there in their belief system. The natural environment is there to sustain you, your immediate family group, your immediate kinship group. And usually that's about the limit of a foraging population. Most of the time, foraging populations are nomadic. Let me see if I can type without making any glitches in the video here. There's no manipulation of the natural environment to modify the food. I think I'll say yearly cycle. There's no modification of the food supply that's going to occur throughout the regular yearly cycle. What I mean here is like the seasons of the year, right? So the seasons of the year are going to give you migration of animals. They're going to give you different fruits and vegetables, different natural things that occur. And a forager never manipulates that natural cycle. As a matter of fact, a lot of foraging, one of the strategies that they use, one of the habits, let me say that word, one of the habits that is part of the overall subsistence strategy is to be something that we call nomadic. Let me spell it correctly. To be nomadic. If you're nomadic, you move from place to place. And in a lot of cases, foragers at least move 4 times a year because they're following the seasons of the year. They're following the migratory pattern of animals that is their dominant food source. Multiple reasons. But one of the reasons that they move from place to place, here's movement in Mr. Help. One of the reasons that they move is because they do not make modifications to the natural environment. And if they stayed in one place too long, they could and would overtax the foods that are naturally occurring in the environment and therefore potentially permanently damage the naturally occurring populations of those foods. So often foraging societies are nomadic. I say often because there are places in the world like tropical equatorial regions that have a whole lot of plant life and animal life and don't really have 4 seasons of the year. Often you don't have to be nomadic in those places because there is like a replenishing of the resources so often that, or so rapidly, I guess is the word that I need to use, that you don't have to be nomadic to conserve the naturally occurring populations of plants and animals in your food supply. And you have a huge knowledge about the technical uses of plants, like what can you make cloth out of, or ropes, or strings, or whatever you need, baskets. You have a huge knowledge of not only the things that are edible in your immediate natural world, but also the things that can be used for technical purposes, like those tools that I just mentioned, or medicinal purposes. You also keep your population intentionally low if you're a forager, because that's another way that you conserve the natural environment. You don't have too many people in your society to need too much, right? Because the natural environment only produces so much, and you also are very respectful of the other animals in your natural environment that need to eat some of the same things that you do. So we have a lot of talk about sustainability and finding, ethical treatment of animals, or ethical food sources, ethically harvested different things. Foragers don't have that problem. Some of the social problems that we have because of our modern day lifestyle and our modern subsistence strategies, those social issues don't exist in foraging. Okay, so let's move on to horticulture, the next thing on our list. And horticulture, let me give you a disclaimer really quick first before we learn much about it. First of all, if you do a quick internet search on horticulture, most of the hits that are going to show up are going to be in the biology field, or the botany more specifically field, because horticulture is sort of a subfield of botany where you make small scale plant production, sometimes flowers like orchids or something. It was sometimes when I did a search for horticulture, I got a lot of like orchid cultivation websites that showed up for some reason. That's not the kind of horticulture that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about horticulture as a subsistence strategy. In the archaeology record, we have evidence of past societies, horticulture societies, that began about 12,000 years ago. I've read a couple of sources that say maybe it's 13,000 years ago, but in the archaeology record, there's evidence of manipulation of the land, keeping and preserving seeds from one growing season to the next, and also permanent settlements for the first time in human history. There are some maps that we will look at in another video where we will see where these cultural hearths were. There, we can identify through the archaeology record where were these original horticultural hearths in the world, because that's where population began to expand. So horticulture is small scale production of plants. Crops you might want to use, but I don't want you to use that word crops if you are going to associate agriculture with it. Most of us do. And while horticulture is planting plants to cultivate them and bring them to harvest so that you can have food to feed your immediate social group with, don't think of them as a huge yield of don't think of horticultural lifestyle as producing a surplus. There's a key word that we need to look at. There is no surplus. Oh, I should put the word no in front of that. There is no surplus that the planting of crops or the production of crops in horticulture produces. So even though horticulture does bring about a change of lifestyle so that human populations can and did, according to archaeological evidence, increase. So horticulture sustains larger larger numbers of people in the population than foraging did, because you are manipulating the natural environment to have a predictable productivity, have a predictable yield of the plants that you focus on. And excuse me. In horticulture, it's small scale production of plants and crops with no surplus, and also it's all manpower. Let me type manpower. There we go. So it's all manpower. There are no machines. No complicated tools. They will have maybe digging sticks that they've made, baskets to carry things with, but there's no tools, complicated tools. There's no beasts of burden is another phrase that we need to know about in cultural geography class. A beast of burden is an animal that has been domesticated to aid a human population. So for instance, I think the very first archaeological evidence of a domesticated animal, I believe, are wolves, and I believe human populations used wolves to transport stuff on sleds or carts or things. I believe that's what it is. But horticulture is really before other animals were domesticated, like chickens or geese or ducks or pigs or cows or any of those, llamas. Llamas actually in Peru are one of the very first animals that, in archaeological evidence. Alpacas and llamas were one of the first herding animals that we have evidence in the archaeology record that they were domesticated in herds to use the milk and to use the meat and the blood products that you could get from those animals to feed your population. So horticulture is really a little bit before domestication of animals, but foraging, there were animal calories that were consumed in horticultural societies, because foraging was also a supplemental part of the food that was consumed in horticulture societies. It was a supplemental part. Another thing is in horticulture societies, regarding social equality, every community worked together to feed the entire community. So when you hear of commune or communal living, horticultural societies were the epitome of that. The men and those who were strong enough to do so would clear fields and work the fields and harvest the crops, whereas the gender roles specified that females would take care of young, take care of old, take care of domestic duties, process the food, and those kinds of things for the most part, and do the foraging activities for the most part. Kill squirrels or snare birds or do something, catch fish, do those kinds of things that would also contribute to the food supply. So there's still a gender role difference between males and females in a horticulture society like there is in a foraging society, but the social value of the work that was done by females and males was still so close in social value, the amount of social value that it gave, it was so close that you do not see inequality and hierarchy and wealth versus poverty. You do not see that in the habits and the norms and the customs and traditions of horticultural societies. That is a social problem that does not happen until land ownership comes into play with agriculture. So horticulturalists also don't own the land. There's a general idea that a community has access or natural right to certain pieces of land that they only manipulate as little as possible in order to get the yield that they need to feed their immediate social group for the 12-month period of the year. They don't put back a surplus for a rainy day. They don't sell things for a profit. And most of the activities that they do is still focused on teaching the young people how to take over in the food supply once they get old enough to do so. So most of the time of the day is spent on food getting skills. Okay, so we will talk about some of these early subsistence strategies again in our next video. Bye.